To a greater or lesser extent, we all know the myth of Batman, that story in which a boy loses his parents in a random act of violence. He swears to stop crime in his city and dedicates his life to training his mind and body to fulfill this purpose, as Batman the Dark Knight. However, this story has been told so many times that over the years, some things have changed. Sometimes Thomas Wayne avoids conflict, while other times he protects his family and confronts the attacker. Sometimes a regular thief commits the crime. In Batman 89, is it Joker before his transformation or someone else? Sometimes it's random violence, other times it's due to class conflict. This shows Batman's origin can change, but to what extent? Stories like Aztec Batman offer this by drawing key elements from the Batman myths. And it takes them to a pre-Hispanic narrative in which a young man named Xochitl becomes a Bat warrior. Mexica at the time of the conquest. Who is the two-faced character in this universe after witnessing his father die by Hernan Cortez's sword? This creates a totally different view of what Batman is. Particularly because it's a fictional narrative, but it takes some real historical elements that had to be thoroughly studied by the production team. So making this film was not an easy task. As a result, some audiences highly praised the film, while others heavily criticized it. Some believe this story negatively depicts Spaniards of that era, casting them as clear villains. In that comic book story of good versus evil, how did the film evolve and what is the controversy? In this video, I'll discuss this topic and share my interview with part of the production team. The voice of Batman, an ethnohistory graduate and someone who has also developed Batman for DC Comics. To be able to understand this film in depth, I'm Go the Geek Monitor, and today we'll take Aztec Batman very seriously. Let's go! The Geek Monitor. The first thing you need to know about Aztec Batman is that even though it's a Warner Brothers franchise, there was a lot of Mexican talent involved in this production. To begin with, the premise came from a Mexican.
Aztec Batman was inspired by José Carlos García de Letona, vice president of Anima. He had the idea of putting the DC characters into the Aztec universe, right?
Anima Studios is a Mexican animation studio known for several notable projects. Among them are the Don Gato and his gang movie and the universe of the Leyendas films. For this project, they also partnered with Chatrone, making Batman Azteca a joint production of Warner Brothers Animation, Anima Studios, and Chatrone. At first, it wasn't meant to be a movie.
Well, it was originally thought of as a series, not just a single movie, right? So there were, a lot more characters, there were many more stories, right? Which, had to be cut.
Sometimes projects start one way and end up another.
Interestingly, Warner Brothers saw enough potential in the Mexican market to take the risk of launching Aztec Batman. Many still believe Mexico is not very relevant in entertainment. However, in recent years, it has been proven that this is not the case. We've been the top market worldwide for films like Flow or Memories of a Snail, and now Mexico is a leading destination for major movie and franchise media tours. Therefore, the country is constantly hosting major fan events where the audience and the talent behind these films can interact. Before the pandemic, this was much rarer. I've already lost count of how many times I've seen a celebrity say they cried with Rope Grill. Anthologies like Batman, The World, Joker, The World, and Superman. The world showcased these characters' adventures. DC is present in several countries, always including Mexico since it's a major comic book market globally.
I think that sometimes, which is really important to mention, and that's a real fact. I mean, Mexico is one of the biggest countries in the world. So, I mean, just by the sheer number of people, that already covers a lot of purchasing. And if you add to that the fact that at least Batman and Superman have always been a big part of Mexican culture. I mean, for many, many years.
So we can understand why we're such an important market for DC Comics, and we can understand why a project like Aztec Batman was given the green light. But I believe there are even stronger connections between Batman and Mexicans. For example, did you know that we can link the creation of Batman to a Mexican historical figure? That's right, just as you heard. When Bob Kane and Bill Finger created Batman in 1939, they drew inspiration from heroes and vigilantes in old comics and pulp magazines, including The Shadow and El Zorro, whose adventures occurred in California when it was part of Mexican territory. El Zorro has another connection too.
Remember, El Zorro's image is entirely inspired by the Mexican character Caballero Murrieta.
Joaquin Murrieta is a Mexican folk figure, famous as a vigilante. A Western Robin Hood seeks revenge after his brother is lynched, his wife assaulted, and he's whipped. His life is shrouded in legends, but this is what's said in the most popular versions of his story.
His connection with El Zorro is so strong in the 1998 movie.
Antonio Banderas portrays Alejandro Murrieta, Joaquin's brother, who is trained to succeed the original Zorro, Don Diego de la Vega.
Notice the parallels to Batman. Both Murrieta and Bruce Wayne choose to challenge the system after having been victims of a great injustice, a narrative that unfortunately really resonates with us Latinos.
Mexico is full of this sense of injustice, this lack of awareness that the ruling classes sometimes have, and how sometimes power tends to become corrupt, especially in places like, sadly, Latin America. So this image of the vigilante who is like the defender, who is like this character, like an outsider who is outside the law and is trying to protect the people, well, it's an image that we Latinos can really identify with, I think, much more.
At first, Aztec Batman seems random, but it actually makes sense if you think about it.
If Batman could have existed in any culture, it would be in the Mexica, because the warriors used to dress as animals, right? So you had eagle warriors, jaguar warriors, that really clicked with us. We said, of course, why wouldn't there be a bat warrior?
However, despite all this, it's a fact that Batman is one of the most important symbols in American comics.
Adapting his story to a pre-Hispanic context was definitely challenging.
To begin with, because the creative team had to follow several guidelines.
Although our character is not Bruno Diaz, he's not Bruce Wayne, he's actually Joe Aliquad, he's a different character. Well, we had to follow the main guidelines of, okay, what does Batman do and what doesn't Batman do? And how does he behave? And yes, all those rules, and also the rules from our historical consultant of no, but weren't the Aztecs like that?
That means that, in addition to the guidelines that artists and writers regularly worked together on a DC Comics project where they also followed historical guidelines. Honestly, the production team outdid themselves here.
My role, unlike in other productions, was to do very thorough research on the subject, along with the historian Alejandro Diaz Barriga, who was providing me with information. Say it however you like. We edited it.
Sorry, Diego Day, we forgot to edit it.
Bibliography, so we could get this out. So, well, my role was precisely to bring to life a civilization that was destroyed 500 years ago. So that it feels colorful, so that it feels alive, so you can see the vegetation, the animals, right, from that period.
This is important, since pop culture, like the series about Hernan Cortés, often shapes our perceptions. We have the idea that the Mexicas lived in worlds with very little color, when the reality was completely different.
Because generally when Tenochtitlan is represented, it's seen as a very gray city, right, with very dull colors and so on. Something like what happens with the Greeks, where later they make everything white, and in reality it was full of colors, so it was more or less the same here, right? And Hernan Cortés describes that in his letters to King Carlos, that everything was full of color, right? And the walls were polished so much that from a distance they thought the city was made of silver, right? Things like that.
Representing this culture in all its splendor and colors is challenging because it requires extensive research.
Very difficult. Let's say the Spaniards devoted themselves to burning almost everything, both buildings and documents. So from the few documents that remain, we can get the colors because they're quite vivid. We have the Codex Mendocino, which was a great help because it shows the clothing, the colors of the warriors and the everyday people. Hasta the Codex Ixtlilxochitl, which had references to the Templo Mayor, but from Texcoco there are many. The Lienzo de Tlaxcala, for example, helped us a lot with the costumes of the warriors, both Spanish and Aztec, because in the Lienzo de Tlaxcala you can find the shields.
This refers to things like backgrounds, settings, clothing, etc. However, another very important point was the character design, because we had to represent essential characteristics of Batman, but using materials and designs that were consistent with the era and the narrative. Though it sounds impressive, they still had to consider which bodies appeared in the film.
It can't be a character like that, like Schwarzenegger or Van Damme. The diets they followed and the type of exercise they did were mostly athletic. So the bodies, the physique of the warriors and the women, well, it had this more oriental aspect. If you want, we were given Bruce Lee as an example, for instance, as someone with all the strength in the world, but without a huge back.
which contrasts a lot with the traditional superhero comic book aesthetic where they're usually shown with much bigger muscles. This was also a challenge in designing the characters.
Like I was telling you, at first I was really influenced by Bruce Timm and everything we saw in the animated Batman series. Above all, I had that background when it came to designing Batman, and I referenced that a lot in the beginning. But the doctor who was advising us kept bringing us back down to earth, telling us, no, not so much. Take away some muscle, make him slimmer, focus more on this.
So well, the challenge was to make Batman, but at the same time give him this pre-Hispanic aesthetic and a certain realism, and the designs turned out to be quite ingenious.
On Batman's armor, you see how he has those spikes on his forearms? And me? What I put was a kind of protective shield, a piece of armor that Yuhuali would put here to protect himself in war. And I added some sharp obsidian pieces, kind of to make that reference to Batman's suit inspired by the Makua Huitl. The weapons, those of the warriors, Eagle and others, were basically flat boards, and on the edges, on the tips, they had these very sharp blocks of obsidian.
However, you have to keep in mind that in this kind of productions, Warner is watching everything very closely, because precisely, it's an external studio working on one of their most lucrative franchises. So Warner makes sure that everything is in order.
Warner checked everything. I mean, we sent Warner all the character designs, we sent them all the backgrounds for the movie, all the animated sequences, all the sequences already in comp, everything, absolutely everything was being reviewed. Of course, the script, the storyboard, the animatic, everything was being reviewed by Warner. In fact, every Friday we would send the material to Warner for them to review.
That's production and design. What about the story? Does it really do justice to Batman? Let's get into that. In Batman Azteca, the Dark Knight isn't Bruce Wayne, but a young man named Joe Wally Coati. Though it's a different character, his story still touches places that feel familiar. For example, Joe Wally decides to train his body so he can seek justice after his father's death. He has a loyal servant aiding his mission, battles villains like Two-Face, and receives help from Catwoman. Besides the obvious similarities, there are also less apparent ones. I liked how, as in some versions, Bruce Wayne falls into a cave with bats after his parents' death. Meanwhile, here Joe Wally comes across the lost temple of Tzinakan after his great tragedy, a temple that will serve him as a sort of bat cave. Another interesting detail is that, like in the comics, Bruce Wayne feels called by the spirit of the bat. Here, part of the movie has to do with how Joe Wally gradually accepts his role as the herald of Tzinakan, the bat god his family worships. But it's one that Joe Wally initially has a conflict with. Having said that, this Batman also has several differences.
Something important about this Batman is that he is a warrior also during the day. He trains to be a warrior. But that's not enough, and he has to embrace something more. And that's when he understands that it's the night and the inhabitant of the night, which is Tzinakan, and then he becomes the Knight of the Night.
Another big difference is that, unlike the traditional Batman, who has to develop his physical and mental side to be able to become the Knight of the Night, Joe Wally also has to develop his spiritual side in order to carry out his work, something for which he doesn't have much time. In all
the stories, he loses someone at a young age and spends years unsure how to handle the pain. As an adult, he becomes the Dark Knight, embracing vengeance and then justice. As in most Batman stories, in this version, little time passes between his loss and becoming Batman.
Despite the differences and new setting, the story's core is one of Batman's classic premises. A young man learns to face his fears. That fear of seeing the people close to you die and the fear of feeling powerless. Just like many of the great Batman stories, they have to do with how Bruce deals with his fears and then uses them to deliver justice. Joe Wally must learn that fear either destroys you or pushes you to act. I think Batman
represents resilience. And it's just that despite the pain, you're going to do the right thing. And despite the anger, you're going to do the right thing.
Similarly, the whole Aztec Batman universe is being created, trying to tell a different story but in a way that contains certain essential elements that feel familiar to us. For example, connecting Catwoman to a Jaguar warrior.
Just like in a Jaguar warrior or something like that. That's what we had in mind. But with the hair and the silhouette, generally thinking of Catwoman. With the poses she can take, like to hide in the shadows and so on. Yes, I referenced a lot, both in Cats and in how Catwoman has been portrayed. What really stands out about her are those pointed ears on her head, right? And we tried to make it so that even though it was a jaguar, since jaguars have flat ears, they're not pointy. So we tried to somehow capture the angle at which they were seen in order to bring her closer to that Catwoman silhouette.
We also see Poison Ivy there, reimagined as a goddess of nature. My favorite reinterpretation in this universe is how they did Joker. What I loved about Yoka, the Aztec Batman universe's Joker, this reinterpretation of the character honors the mythological trickster or deceiver god archetype. In mythology, an archetype is a recurring character model found in many cultures, representing universal ideas. One archetype I love is the trickster. Chaotic characters like Loki often break rules and deceive others to expose hidden truths or challenge authority. Tricksters are not evil as such. But in comic book narratives, Joker could very well be considered one, since he uses wit and deception to commit his crimes. These are often tied to exposing system hypocrisies or truths he believes about the characters. For example, in The Dark Knight, his goal wasn't wealth, but to show that given the right situation, ordinary people would turn on each other. Whereas in The Killing Joke, he intends to prove that the only difference between him and everyone else is just one bad day. But Batman Azteca offers a unique twist, portraying Joker as a Mexica priest who consults Huitzilopochtli and advises King Moctezuma. In a major twist, spoilers, Huitzilopochtli is revealed as Tezcatlipoca, who had been deceiving Joker all along. Just like in that mythological story where Tezcatlipoca tricks Quetzalcoatl into getting drunk with pulque. He realizes it when it's already too late. By now, he has committed a terrible crime against his family and lost his sanity, so he covers his face with ashes, paints a smile with blood, and starts plotting to overthrow the Mexica Empire. In other words, the universe's trickster is created by being tricked by someone else. Another interesting detail about Joker's design is the scars along his arm.
Self-sacrifice was common among the Mexica, which is why Joker's design includes scars on his arms. So when this self-sacrifice happens, and he paints the smile red, I think it gives us a glimpse of a Joker, like we hadn't really seen before.
There's also the fact that at one point in the film, they use him to kill the figure of Moctezuma, something that obviously didn't happen in real life. But look at how they handled it. There are many versions about the death of Moctezuma, and I find this very interesting. Because, for example, in school I was taught that Moctezuma was stoned by the Mexicas because they no longer trusted him. Some versions say he dies from stoning, others say he survives and is killed by the Spaniards, and some say they try to heal him. As Brian Alvarez, an endo-history graduate I interviewed for this video, told me, we'll discuss him shortly. There's no consensus on Moctezuma's death, but the most accepted view is he asked Cortez to kill him so he could enter the heaven of fallen warriors. In Aztec Batman, they use the lack of consensus to create a story where Joker kills Cortez, and he makes the Spaniards get blamed for it. And precisely, I think that's the hardest part to pull off and the most controversial part of Aztec Batman. Inserting a fictional narrative around a person who was real. This is especially evident with this universe's Batman, where Hernan Cortez is reimagined as Two-Face. So, we have a fusion of a fictional character with someone who actually existed. This has generated a lot of controversy, because many people, particularly Spaniards, accuse Aztec Batman of portraying the Spaniards of that time as clear, bloodthirsty villains. In a story of good versus evil, if you're Mexican like me, this may sound odd. Because for us, since we were kids, in school they talked to us a lot about the conquest and how it was an extremely bloody period in history. But in other countries, well, it's different.
In Spain, they have the idea that what they did during the conquest was good. They have this idea that they brought us civilization, that no matter the cost, in the end they civilized us.
According to the book Modern History in Secondary Education from the University of Castilla, focused on Spanish secondary education. This is because in the past, the topic of the conquest was taught briefly and uncritically, presenting this period more as a heroic feat. It should be noted this has changed recently.
The conquest was bloody, and all subsequent practices were unbalanced. Despite the existence of the law of Burgos, which did not allow the Spanish to judge the indigenous people, in the end they did.
And yes, as Brian mentions, even though by the time Hernan Cortez arrived in our territory, there were already regulations regarding the treatment of indigenous people, such as the laws of Burgos. Much evidence shows these laws weren't enforced.
We have references. Bernal Diaz del Castillo notes that when Hernan Cortez arrived in Cholula, he carried out a massacre even though the indigenous people were at a festival and had not attacked him. The Toxcatl massacre, were the Spaniards already in Tenochtitlan? Cortez wasn't there this time. Actually, the one who did it was Pedro de Alvarado, And since they were trapped, they thought the Mexico were going to kill them there in Tenochtitlan. So before they kill me, I'd rather kill them first.
Many elements appeared in Batman Azteca, but some things were left out, possibly for being too graphic.
The famous coliquor, the aterramiento, where are the Spaniards in Cholula? And they have war dogs hunting dogs fighting the indigenous people?
However, many criticisms were based on the trailer, as the film actually explains this. The Mexicas practiced violent rituals and faced discontent from other groups, such as the Tlaxcaltecas. This enabled Cortés to form alliances that helped him overthrow the empire. Above all, I think it's important to keep in mind that when talking about these topics, it's not a matter of Mexicans versus Spaniards. First of all, because Mexico didn't even exist yet, and we are the result, for better or worse, of all these historical problems. And yes, they were very violent. The criticism is directed specifically at what the conquistadors, the Spaniards of that era, did. Another point that's also worth highlighting is that the film does show us that the Spaniards had technology that the Mexica didn't. But at the same time, we're also told that some of their beliefs were wrong. For example, there's a scene where Cortés says he believes the sun orbits the earth. Meanwhile, Joe Wally tells him the Mexica know Earth isn't the center of everything. Which also helps to eradicate this idea that pre-Hispanic cultures were obsolete and backward, when the reality is that in many ways they were at the forefront of their time. So, with all this in mind, why was an Aztec Batman necessary?
Something we needed to see? We know the story, we are fully aware of who we are fully aware of the encounter and the mixing, and also of the things that were imposed. Our history is built on pain and dispossession, though some parts are filled with love, but pain and dispossession are significant. Right? Does fantasy help us find the way to heal this wound that is still open?
Aztec Batman is fictional and should be seen that way. But we must keep in mind that this story does not intend to erase what already exists, but rather to expand the myth of Batman, existing in the rare magical space between fiction and history, myth and reality. A film that uses the comic book multiverse to explore pain and justice in a way that resonates with our Latino collective unconscious.
That reveals a very different story, even if it seems familiar.
Which invites us to question ourselves, who are we and from where are we telling these stories?
From the viewpoint of the defeated, the conquerors, or even indifference.
Thus, Batman Azteca establishes the idea that Batman today functions as an almost archetypal figure and can be reinterpreted to fit different narratives and contexts. Because the fear of death, injustice and pain are universal concepts that can certainly be expressed through the story of a young man who, after a great tragedy, finds in the night and in the bat the path he needs to fight injustice.
Don't leave yet. If you enjoyed this video essay about Batman Azteca, I invite you to subscribe to my channel to watch more video essays like this one. Because I really like to take superheroes very seriously. I also thank all the talent shown here for their time and their interviews. You can find their social media in the video description. That's all for today. I'm Go the Geek Monitor, and keep looking beyond the obvious.